Welcome to today's event. I'm pausing in the overview of the 7 Fitness series. The usual discussion, I've been going through each of the different areas and spending 3 segments on that particular area. But today I want to focus on something a little bit different, taking a pause because we've just finished the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And then we're going to be getting into the relationship, professional, and financial. And I talk about this in the context of moving from the be, do, have to have, do, be. And in the process, we're becoming that person that we need to become to achieve our life vision, our life design, whatever it is that you're doing. I'm going to work through that. It's only a 45-minute session, so we're not going to go super deep, but I want to build a framework that we can then speak to in the future. So here's the framework. As I said, you probably have seen it before: mental, physical, spiritual on the left, then emotional in the middle. So this is the be and the do. This is what's in our control. And I don't talk about spiritual in the context of like biblical spirituality. It's more about our higher self and consciousness so that we can take charge of those powerful present moments. That part is in our control. So in order to be proactive, we have to have agency over that left side. Emotional is real powerful. I talk about emotional in the context of being the gateway to the right side. We all know that we can get hijacked in the emotional area. I talk about taking the escalator up, like trust is built on the escalator going up, but it's often lost on the elevator going down. You can lose trust in a moment. You can tear down something that you've built up in a moment, figuratively speaking. But the emotional area is also an empowerment catalyst. It's a place that we can supercharge and turbocharge our efforts by infusing them with emotion. We call it energy in motion, and that's where that connects. But today, what I'll talk about is personal leadership as a foundation to agency, and agency as being necessary to be truly empowered. This foundation isn't just a theory, it's a practical strategy for thriving in our volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. I'll refer to that as VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This content aligns with self-determination theory, and I'm a big fan of that. I think of it like a forgotten theory. It's a powerful theory, but I think it started its time more in the mental health space. And by the way, what I'm talking about is not mental health at all. It's about the business. When I talk about anxiety, it's about that day-to-day business anxiety that we can get. But the self-determination theory is very powerful, especially in terms of what leaders need today in building and maintaining high-performing teams in a complex, changing environment. The self-determination theory highlights 3 pillars of intrinsic motivation: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. These pillars are so powerful that I can argue autonomy alone can serve as an incentive. Connecting this to the 7 fitness areas emphasizes the importance of putting the conscious mind in charge of the unconscious. This is the purpose of the 7 fitness areas framework. By doing so, we shift from a have-do-be paradigm, as I mentioned, to a be-do-have. And we do that by taking charge of those powerful present moments that are around us all the time. If you think about a moment can be less than a second, just think about the tens of thousands of moments that we actually have available to us. But if we're living a life by habit, then we're missing out on the opportunity that we have. This shift in paradigm, it enables us to unlock our full potential and to navigate challenges that we're going to have by using resilience and purpose. Personal leadership is essential for building our capacity for agency. Agency is the ability to act independently and make free choices. And it's the strategy that allows us to move from merely surviving to truly thriving. Remember, the unconscious was designed, or the basis of the unconscious is to make sure that we survived long enough to procreate. It's about survival. It's not really, the setup wasn't about thriving. That's something we add on with our heart, with our desires, with our purpose. Now, in a world filled with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, having agency is crucial for navigating the unknown challenges that we're going to face. To navigate a complex, uncertain, and ambiguous world, we must align our strategies with core principles to ensure stability and direction. Now, these known elements, stability and direction, provide a sense of stability amidst the unknown. The unconscious treats the unknown as a threat, which is why we must redefine how we use our unconscious mind. Agency equips us to see beyond immediate threats and recognize opportunities. It provides a framework to organize the chaos in a way of thinking about it. It enables us to be proactive, understanding that actively choosing not to make a decision is still being proactive. The conscious versus the unconscious is a big part of the 7 Fitness series. As a matter of fact, in the mental, physical, and spiritual, it comes up, and it's all about getting ourselves, positioning ourselves so that we can have the conscious mind in charge of the unconscious. Now, the conscious mind is no match for the speed of the stimuli and impulses that we're encountering daily. However, the unconscious operates with incredible efficiency, processing up to 11 million bits per second compared to the conscious mind's 50 bits per second. With the conscious mind's reaction time of about 200 milliseconds, we need a change if we're to pursue our vision effectively. What I'm saying there is that because the unconscious is so fast, 11 million bits per second, by the time the conscious mind is aware of what's going on, potentially 200 milliseconds or possibly more have already passed, giving the unconscious up to 2 million bits of information that's been processed already. This is why triggering can happen. And if you ever spotted, if you ever notice somebody getting triggered, or maybe somebody reacting who has a phobia, it happens so quick. And by the time they're able to even pay attention to what you might be saying, the cortisol and adrenaline are already into the fight and flight, freeze or faint, and it's very difficult to talk a person back once that happens. Now, in the mental, physical, and spiritual area, I do make a distinction between the what I'll call mental cognitive processes, but there's also physical cognitive processes. Why? Because things like serotonin and dopamine, that's neurobiological. Things like neurons and the neural pathways and myelin, that's physiological. So when you start looking at the neurobiology, and you have to look at that as more physical in terms of cognitive processes, it starts to open the door to understanding what's actually going on. Now, the unconscious is about past associations. The habits formed from these associations are inadequate for our current roles as leaders and business owners. By consciously directing our unconscious, we can leverage its automaticity to work in our favor. This doesn't mean our unconscious was actively working against us in the past. Rather, the conditioning from ages 0 to 7 is often outdated and certainly not tailored to our current roles. Purpose as fuel and the drive is why I say start with purpose. Purpose provides that fuel. It gives us the drive. It gives us the resiliency. When you're working on purpose, you can go for, we've seen it, months and years without pay. Look at how some of these startups, they're focusing on their purpose and they're able to go for so long without pay. And then it blows up in the end in terms of all that energy that's been organized is let loose. So again, starting with purpose, it provides the fuel and the drive to meet the challenges ahead. And in a VUCA world, especially as VUCA accelerates, we're going to face an exponentially increasing set of possibilities, largely in the category of the unknown. As I said, the unconscious treats the unknown as a threat. However, to exercise agency, I prefer to view this as a field of infinite possibilities. Our job is to remain resourceful and maintain a growth mindset, knowing that the past doesn't equal the future. Extracting our vision from this field of possibility requires the resilience that purpose provides and the automaticity from having the conscious mind in charge of the unconscious. From survivor to thriver is what I'm talking about. Making that shift from being a survivor to becoming a thriver, or consistently being a thriver. If you're in business already, you already get it. You're already doing that thrive. But it involves, to do it at the higher levels, involves the be, do, have paradigm, which is a main objective of the 7 Fitness Areas framework. This paradigm emphasizes being present in more of the moments that we have, not necessarily all the moments, but enough to meet the requirements of our vision. The 95% of our lives that's run by habit isn't the problem. The issue is that these habits, based on past associations, don't serve our current vision. Our habits need adjusting to align with our vision. In the 7 Fitness Areas framework, I discuss how once the conscious mind is in charge of the unconscious, habit change becomes easier. We aren't actually breaking the habit, but rather replacing it. And this is where myelin comes in and synaptogenesis. When truly aligned with purpose, often the awareness that a habit doesn't serve us is enough to activate the neuroplasticity needed to replace the habit. Not always, but certainly that's the target and we want to continue stepping more and more into that direction. And this process includes training our unconscious to see certain emotions as excitement rather than anxiety. And this is not about tricking the unconscious. It's that anxiety and excitement have a similar signature. Without understanding that, it's too often to feel excitement that can come, for example, with rising above the line or getting close to our goal. Because it's so similar to anxiety, it can trigger past associations that may be negative, past associations that may trigger limiting beliefs. And that's how we can get into that. It's almost in reach, and then we fall down. And it can become a pattern if you're not careful. So we have to talk through that to make sure that we retrain it so that it's scanning for positive factors instead of negative ones, and that we're also adjusting our reactions so that the reactions are appropriate for when we're rising above the line. In the framework, I refer to this as shifting from resistance factors to empowerment catalysts. This involves updating the unconscious patterns that govern our actions, ensuring that they support our desired outcomes. By fostering personal leadership, we can consciously shape these habits to better serve our goals and aspirations. Aligning strategies with core principles is the next step. Align the strategies with the core principles, and that's how we're going to create some certainty and some consistency when things are VUCA all around us. Specifically, I would say looking for principles that worked in a more analog environment, like farming. These are the principles that will continue to hold value and that we can rely on. Just consider how old our brain is. Our brain has been working the same for centuries. Now, there might be some things that change, but when you look at farming, yes, they've sped it up with technology and who knows at what cost. But farming is still following the same basic principles. And our ancestors went for years and years thriving in an agricultural age, following principles that were handed down to them. Agriculture gave way to the industrial age, where the assembly line provided the speed and consistency to break through the existing barriers at the time. Later, technology followed suit with scientific calculators and spreadsheets and computers. The same thing happened with the internet, and now it's happening again with artificial intelligence. These advancements speed up processing, but they don't change the underlying principles. VUCA still exists. Think about it like the world being fractal. You can see the same patterns. In fact, you've seen these cycles, and within the big cycle, there's some smaller cycles, and then you zoom in and you look at the smaller cycles, and there's similar cycles even in there. So when you think about VUCA being more of a fractal thing, we've always had the VUCA, but as technology processing speeds up the environment around us, it's naturally going to be that we see more and more of this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. What's more is, as I mentioned, the conscious mind is no match for the speed of the unconscious, so it doesn't feel like we're keeping up, we're behind. I started noticing some interesting patterns when I had my motorcycle business. So this was a global motorcycle business, renting to people from around the world, mostly sport touring. And sport touring, think of it as riding twisty roads, ideally twisty roads that you don't know. So it puts you into this sort of flow state because you're concentrating on being safe while still riding spiritedly. And you can't see around these turns, so you're hyper aware. You will literally get mentally exhausted after a couple of 100 miles of riding like this in the twisties, which is why it's so addictive. It sort of puts you into a meditative state, if you will, because, as I already said, flow, because you're so focused on staying alive. And it's the precision, it's deciding, is this upcoming turn or using cues? Is this an increasing radius? Is it a decreasing radius? Do I need to be rolling off here? Can I start accelerating? And especially if it's undulating, you can't see which way it's going. So you do things like look at the trees and other cues that will tell you what it might be doing. Sometimes you get it wrong, so you're constantly aware. And then, of course, there's always the possibility of a car. And, I've had more than my share of trucks coming into my lane. They're speeding and they go over the yellow line. I'm turning left and they're turning right, and they can't hold their line. They go over the yellow line, and making that adjustment, you don't have time to think. This is an unconscious process. The reason I bring it up is that there were three things that came to my attention with that motorcycle world. My target audience were generally over 40. I did rent to people under that, but they had to have the means and the desire to go to a different country and ride, for a week or two at a time on vacation through these twisties. And I was in California, so it was like perfect because you could ride 10 days in a row without repeating any roads, doing a big loop or triangle, what have you. The first thing I noticed was how consistent the seasonality was. Anybody who's in a seasonal business can probably attest to this. It was weird because every year there's new riders entering and new models showing up, and the geopolitical and geoeconomical things were changing, but the consistency, when you look at it in trends, the consistency of when customers started booking, the date of the earliest reservations, even the annual dip in reservations around the World Cup soccer, it was uncanny how consistent it was. And I used to just marvel at it because I'd be sitting there in February feeling like crickets, there's nothing happening, and then all of a sudden the reservations start coming in. They peak around September, and then it drops. Now this would be different depending on where you are, and it's because the people who do this rental for vacation, they tend to go to the places where the climate is right for them. You would see them avoiding the Las Vegas airport in the hotter months, and they would come to the San Francisco airport where I was during the middle of the summer. And then as it got cooler, they would shift to the Las Vegas airport as their starting point. The second thing I noticed was that despite the advances in technology over the years, anti-lock brakes, traction control, better suspension, stiffer frames, the accidents that we're seeing from riders doesn't really change. It's rider error. They're making the same rider errors me and my buddies made 50 years ago when we were riding. And it's repeating. It's uncanny how similar they are. And again, despite the advances in all of the rider aids and et cetera. And then the last one is that despite being from all over the world, the accomplished riders, we all had the same philosophy about staying safe, about spirited riding. We could all finish each other's sentences when it came to how we approach blind turns and how we deal with an undulating road, and what do we do when we're tired, and how do you notice when you're tired. All of that was the same. I bring it up because what I'm talking about is how it's a very analog environment, and when you start building from what works in an analog environment, the principles that work in an analog environment, it starts to make more sense. So as we move forward and we get a little bit further into finding security in a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, we want to start looking at how do we align strategies with core principles. Remember, resourcefulness requires us to understand that excitement is not the same as anxiety. By reinterpreting our physiological responses, we can harness our energy for productive action. Examples from the motorcycle business, as I said, showed me how these patterns are sort of, I'll say, universal. In keeping with the idea of principles, I'm going to take 3 principles introduced by Jim Collins in 2 of his books. One is Good to Great, one of my favorites for years, but now great by choice because it deals with a more volatile environment. Now, each of these principles is powerful in itself, but there are more. He gives many principles in each book. I'll be covering those over the next few weeks, but all of them are super powerful and they work together. And thanks to the rigorous research that his team conducted and the way they did the research with comparison companies, and because they used public companies, they were able to extract information that you wouldn't normally be aware of, and especially when he compared it to companies that did well in a very volatile environment, and what was existing before the inflection point and what was existing after the inflection point. The way he did that research and showed the comparisons, you can't unsee it. So while it's beyond the scope of today's presentation to dive into all the details of his research method and all the principles that he has in his books, I'll discuss 3 principles today. One is the level 5 leadership, and that's from Good to Great. The second one is the 20-mile march. That's from Great by Choice. And the third one is the flywheel concept, and that's from Good to Great. And I'll talk about how these work together to set a framework. Now remember, what we're talking about is this moving from through the 7 fitness areas We gain control of our unconscious by putting the conscious mind in charge. We learn to modulate our emotions so we don't get hijacked, and that what we intend to do is very close to what we actually do because we're not getting hijacked, we're not getting whipsawed around. And through that, we can now focus on the right side. So when I was looking at what to do about the right side, relationships, professional, and financial, there's so much written about these areas. Obviously, none of this, I'm not intending, I don't want to be the guru. It's about helping people see how it works so you become your own guru. Because in a world that's so complex and volatile, you have to be able to change on a dime, make a change on an instant, but you're not making a wholesale change. You're amending. You're just amending the strategy enough so that you can stay on course. So when I got to the relationship, professional, and financial, I want to focus on, again, principles that work. So I looked at how the research was done, and I'm using books that go deep in the methodology of research so that I know that what they found, one, is consistent with what was found in the New Thought era, the New Thought era being from about 1850 to 1930 or 40 or so. And this is when the philosophers were vigorously writing about the unconscious and habits and health and these sorts of topics. And it was accelerated by the advent of the printing press. When I look at these philosophers now, they had it right. Obviously, they didn't have the measurement tools we have available to us today, so they described the inner workings a little bit differently, but essentially they had it right. So the principles that worked for them in 1850 and 1900, they still work today. It's just that the processing is faster. So I wanted to make sure that I used current books that align with what was true for the last 2 centuries, because then I know we're working with principles. And that's why I like Jim Collins' book so much. That's why I like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's a good one, foundational for the relationships. And then Jim Collins' books, Good to Great and Great by Choice, are excellent for the professional area. And then when you get to financial, there's enough written about understanding compounding, and you'll have a sense of where we go on the financial area. But for right now, I'm just making the case about agency. So the principles, level 5 leadership, 20-mile march, and the flywheel principle, these principles are interdependent and deeply connected to personal leadership and agency. By understanding and applying them, we can navigate challenges with resilience and purpose. Level 5 leadership, as described by Jim Collins in Good to Great, is characterized by a unique blend of personal humility and professional will. Level 5 leaders are modest, yet incredibly determined to achieve their goals. They prioritize the organization's success over personal ambition and are relentless in their pursuit of excellence. Becoming a level 5 leader requires personal leadership, and I talked about that earlier, the ability to lead oneself with integrity, vision, and discipline. It also demands agency, the capacity to make intentional choices and take deliberate actions. The tenets of leader as coach, which is a leadership style I recommend, especially for small businesses as they're developing what their leadership process will be. Leader as coach aligns seamlessly with level 5 leadership. And it's a great way to start the foundation, because from there you can go any direction you want. Leader as coach has the leader wearing many hats, which is what's needed in a world of VUCA. As a coach, a leader empowers their team. They foster a growth mindset. They create an environment where individuals can thrive. To embody level 5 leadership, one must exercise agency to continuously develop the skills and mindset necessary for this high level of leadership. It is through personal leadership that we cultivate the humility and resolve that define level 5 leaders. The 20-mile march is the next one, and this one he introduced is in the Great by Choice. He goes through a great story about 2 explorers going into the South Pole and provides a dramatic picture of how these 2 approached it and how different the results were based on that approach. But then what's interesting is later in his research, he found other things that were like so identical, back to patterns and principles, to the distinction between these 2 explorers. It's definitely worth the read if you haven't read it or listened to Great by Choice. The 20-mile march emphasizes the importance of consistent, disciplined progress. It involves setting clear performance markers and committing to achieving them, regardless of external conditions. This principle is crucial for minimizing the impact of VUCA as it provides a stable framework for navigating uncertainty. Life and the world around us are fractal patterns, as I've mentioned. They repeat at different scales, from centuries to minutes. You can see patterns. The volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is present in these cycles, and the 20-mile march offers a roadmap to maintain consistency amid the chaos. By adhering to this principle, we create a buffer against the unpredictable and establish a rhythm of steady progress. The 20-mile march requires personal leadership to set meaningful goals and the discipline to pursue them. It also demands agency to make consistent efforts, even when faced with challenges. I mentioned before about being proactive, and sometimes not making a decision or deciding not to make a decision is a way of being proactive. Knowing what to say no to and then having the discipline to say no is also being proactive. This principle teaches us that consistency, more than anything else, helps us weather the storms that we're going to see when we have VUCA. The flywheel concept is the next one, and this is also from Good to Great, as I mentioned. It illustrates how small, consistent actions build momentum over time. The flywheel starts slowly, requiring significant effort to move, but as consistent efforts accumulate, the flywheel gains speed and momentum, making further progress easier. Level 5 leadership and the 20-mile march are essential resources that we need, personal resources, and being able to stay resourceful to put the flywheel into motion and then maintain the behaviors and the activities at the leadership level and the worker level to make it happen. A level 5 leader's determination and humility, combined with the disciplined consistency of the 20-mile march, create the conditions for sustained progress. By following a methodology of consistency, we can project where the flywheel's momentum will lead. Moreover, the consistency and discipline inherent in the 20-mile march help identify necessary shifts in direction and magnitude to stay on course. The proactive approach ensures that our efforts are aligned with our long-term vision, enabling us to achieve significant results over time. These principles, level 5 leadership, the 20-mile march, and the flywheel, are interwoven threads in the fabric of personal leadership and agency. Together, they provide a comprehensive strategy for thriving in a VUCA world. By embodying these principles, we harness the power of personal leadership to lead with integrity and purpose, and we exercise agency to take deliberate, consistent actions. As we move forward, we'll explore how to find security in a VUCA world by aligning our strategies with core principles, and this alignment is key to navigating the uncertainty and achieving our desired outcomes. Next, I'll provide a couple of illustrations for additional context around these ideas. And for that, I'll go to the pad. If you go back to some of my earlier talks, I quite often talked about rising above the line. And the concept of above the line is we have this zone, it's our comfort zone, and we go up and down. As we're getting that near that upper limit, it's like things come out of the woodwork to stop us or slow us down, and then we head back down and we get to that bottom line, that bottom range of our zone, and we do things on purpose to go back up. It's almost like the motivation kicks in, and then we get up here. I talked about having the anxiety that comes with getting close to crossing the line, and we misinterpret that excitement, which is actually more like cognitive dissonance. We misinterpret it as anxiety or maybe signs that things aren't going to work, and then that triggers something else. So I talk about it as it's not just a line, it's a barrier. In that barrier, we have things like stories, we have limiting beliefs, we have habit patterns, we have our own associations or our conditioning. We have our own fears. I can even talk about having a fear of success. It could be that a person had success before and it led to so much pain, they've linked up pain with success. People talk about fear of success. That's what it can look like. You can literally have a phobia of just about anything if enough pain was linked up to it when the association was created. And based on what I've seen, many phobias occur during that 0 to 7, so it's not even a rational connection. Later, you can still contract a phobic response. It may have a rational underpinning, but when you dig into it, you realize that it doesn't really apply because it was a black swan event. So the reason I bring this up is that in order to get above this line, it's going to take some work. And we get in there and we find ourselves getting kicked back. and then we go at it again and we get kicked back. Unfortunately, sometimes we misinterpret enough and we end up going all the way back down here. And if you're not careful, it's harder to make that turn because you have momentum. And I call this the dreaded spiral, and that dreaded spiral can take you right below. So we want to avoid that, and we avoid it by being resourceful. But understand, going above that barrier is going to take some work. It's a lot of ebb and flow. It's not just a simple, hey, I'm above the line and now it's clear sailing. See, the challenge is that all of this is the unknown. And the unknown is unfamiliar, and the unconscious looks at the unfamiliar as a threat. Because it looks at it as a threat, it wants to avoid it. So some of that anxiety or that excitement that you feel is you're literally pushing through barriers. So let's say that this line, part of the reason why this upper line, this upper limit is there is because of a particular limiting belief. As you're crossing that line, you're literally challenging that belief. It stands to reason that if you're challenging that belief, you're going to have something going on internally. I like to say that a breakthrough requires a break with the beliefs of the past or the patterns of the past. And that break with is where you get the cognitive dissonance. And when you recognize it as a cognitive dissonance, and you can recognize it as excitement, you can react to it differently, and that reaction leads to a response. We talk about stimulus response. I say in between the stimulus and response, there's a reaction and a meaning. And that's where we start getting control and putting the conscious mind in charge of the unconscious, because we're going to condition how we want those reactions to unfold and what we want the meaning to be. By the time the conscious mind is aware of a stimulus at 2 million bits of information being processed in just the 0.2 of a second, that represents the conscious mind's reaction time, how can you get ahead of it? You get ahead of it by conditioning in the response and the interpretation that you want. So once you get above this, now something different is happening. You don't have the conditioning of the past. What you have now is a lot of unknown. You have a complete field of possibility. It's so vast that anything is possible, which is why we have to stay resourceful. The image I would like you to have to put this together and sort of cap this off, and I'll pick up from here next week. We have the upper limit. We have the pattern that's been unfolding. And then this thing goes up, and we're resisting the temptation to give up. We push through it. We get through the barrier. And then as we get above it, because you're still going to have the volatility, you'll still have uncertainty. You're going to have even more complexity potential, and you'll have even more ambiguity because you're now in a completely new field. You know, it's nice having structure because it paints the curves for you. So what we want to do is use principles to provide that structure. And the visual I have for this is that as we go above this line, we have a tighter range. And by following principles and having this tighter range, we're able to avoid the whipsaws that come from VUCA. This is a visual that I have, and it's a visual that's consistent with the companies in Good to Great and Great by Choice when they talk about the inflection point. This here, in that sense, would be the inflection point. He says the companies were going along, and the comparison companies that he looked at were going along, and they kept going. But his Good to Great companies, his research required that they continued going for an extended period of time, et cetera, and that the comparison companies continued. So he had a very tight set of organizing principles for his research. When you look at it, again, back to principles, and what I talk about in the 7 fitness areas is all principle based. I did that based on what neuroscience agrees is factual. And when you put those two together, it's about managing the unconscious, putting the conscious mind in charge so that you create this situation and you tame the impact of the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. You contain it by putting the automaticity of the unconscious to work for you. As I said, it wasn't necessarily that it was working against you. It's that the conditioning from 0 to 7 was for a very different time, and that the associations, and this is an important point, the associations from this period when you're doing this are not going to work when you're doing this. They're different associations. Your habits are going to be different. If you live in a stimulus reaction world, you're going to be making wrong choices here because some of those choices are made within that first 200 milliseconds, as a reaction. This is also why it's important, and I talk about this a lot in the 7 fitness areas, it's important to have a pause between stimulus and response. And that pause is where we manage the reaction and the meaning, and a lot of it we can condition in. The reason you want to pause is because where you're going is not the past. We can learn from the past, but if you're using reactionary type leadership to take you into the future, you're going to continue revisiting this trough down here because the actions that you're using are going to be the actions that are consistent with being in that zone, and that's not where you want to be. On the contrary, this becomes a pattern as well. This can become a habit. And now when you get your habits in this tightly knit, and if you look at what Jim Collins says, he says, being consistent, the 20-mile march, resisting the urge to overinvest in good times, resisting the urge to cut spending beyond what's right in tough times. It's sticking to that narrow set of principles or narrow set of constraints, I'll say, to ensure that you can continue to rise. And what this does, you'll find, by getting rid of all of this noise, because you have this tight set of constraints, you find yourself getting triggered by anxious thoughts less frequently. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. I want to pick back up with this diagram next week because I want to continue this idea of where personal leadership and agency comes into play with this. All right, we'll see you next time.